Where's the clicker? Okay. Thank you all so much for having me. I just feel so honored to be here with all of you. Southern Oregon is getting a reputation as a real powerhouse of climate action, citizen engagement, and just sheer human ingenuity. And so I am just thrilled to be here tonight and really happy that you're putting on this incredible two-day conference. And I really want to thank the organizers for putting this on and welcoming me the way they have done. So I come to you as a fourth-generation Oregonian. And let's see if I can get this working. And I am constantly awestruck by thinking about the moment we share in time. Because if you think about it, there's so many generations before us, there's so many generations after us, and yet we're so uniquely positioned here, we're just alive at this moment. And that means something, because we're the first generation to really understand the climate crisis, and we're the last generation to be able to do anything about it. So that's what I'm going to talk about tonight, and I hope that you leave appreciating with me what a privilege it is and an honor it is to be alive just right at this moment. It is daunting. The world's best scientists are telling us that the Earth is in imminent peril. There's urgency behind that. So tonight I'm going to talk about the climate crisis. I know some of you have been here all day, have heard about that all day. But I want to put it into slightly different terms for you. I want to consolidate the material and the effects that you've heard about in one big kind of swallow, because it's really hard to look at these pictures and figure out all these impacts at once. We're used to hearing about these things in little tidbits from the newspaper that we can just put away or the radio that we can turn off. I had to give this lecture yesterday to my class. These students in my class are 25 years old and younger. And it's hard. It's really hard to give this lecture to my classes because this affects them in their lifetimes, at the end of their lifetimes. But even at the age that I'm at right now, things look very, very bleak. But then we're going to talk about the law. I'm an environmental law professor. I've taught environmental law for 20 years. I'm going to explain to you why our statutory laws aren't working, and then explain this other approach where the kids are literally taking their government to court. So I'll explain that, and then we'll finish with what an average citizen can do. I think that's so important to leave this room knowing what we can do. Obviously, the science is in. There's plenty of science. It shows that we are emitting huge amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Most of you know how global warming works. I'm going to talk about carbon dioxide as just kind of the name I'm using for greenhouse gas emissions. I hope you know that methane is a huge source of emissions, 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So when I talk about carbon dioxide, it's just my shorthand for talking about all the greenhouse gases, including methane. Now, carbon dioxide, of course, comes from fossil fuels and the burning of fossil fuels, but methane also comes from natural gas. The fugitive methane emissions from natural gas projects are potentially much worse even than coal burning. And so methane is in here, too, through our natural gas. But what happens is these greenhouse gases pile up in the Earth's atmosphere, and the Earth is like blankets that the Earth can't shake off. The energy can't get back out in space. And so it's causing this tremendous energy imbalance on our Earth. You all feel this. You know the dynamic. If you just sit in a car, you could have done this today. It was 81 degrees today. And I was out in the parking lot, and I had to roll down my window. It was just getting too hot. And so we can roll down our windows when we get the greenhouse gas effect. The planet can't do that, and we're really trapped with this effect going on. The carbon and the carbon dioxide, at least, lingers in the atmosphere for 100 to 1,000 years. And so all the carbon dioxide that was emitted in the past is still up there, and the problem is there's heating in the pipeline. So even if we were to drop or stop all emissions tomorrow, we're still going to have an impact. There's still heating in the pipeline and climate punishment, so to speak. The Earth is heating. It's heated to a degree Fahrenheit. So everything you see in the coming slides is from just 1 degree Fahrenheit, just 1 degree. So what is this causing? It's causing Greenland to break up. It's causing West Antarctica to disintegrate. Dr. Rigneau has said that he believes the collapse of this part of West Antarctica is unstoppable. It's causing sea level rise. This picture is, there's no storm event here, there's no rain. This happens, it's called high tide flooding now. It's a new thing that happens on the East Coast without rain events. The high tide is coming in because the sea level rise, it's swamping certain areas. And what I've noticed over the last few years, and just talking about global warming, is that the projections have gotten worse and worse. It used to be centimeters and then inches and now then feet. And then NOAA projected up to 6 feet by 2100. The latest report by in Science Magazine just a couple days ago literally projects up to 6 meters, although the date is uncertain as to when that would occur. Well, if we lose Greenland, which Dr. James Hansen, who's former head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA, he was this country's leading climate scientist for the government. He has said that our world goal of 2 degrees, which you've probably heard about, that's what all the nations of the world are politically sort of trying to commit to, that could melt Greenland. That alone would cause a 23-foot rise in sea level. And so even well short of 23 feet, the world's megacities are at huge risk. Huge cities are located along the coastlines and are very vulnerable to sea level rise. And all those cities along the coastlines have to make plans. I mean, they have to figure out what they're going to do because they're going to be flooded. Another problem is our oceans. The oceans have been absorbing our carbon dioxide emissions for so long, and so the ocean water has become acidified from that. And it's so acidic now, it's 30% more acidic than before the Industrial Revolution. And what that is causing is the die-off of shellfish, because the shellfish can't survive because the acidic water literally corrodes their shells. And so on the coast of Oregon, the oyster farms are in big trouble because as the little baby oysters try to form their shells, they can't because the ocean water corrodes it. Now, you've all heard of the drought in California, but there's also drought in Oregon, which I'll get to in a moment. The drought in California is so extreme, but it's nothing new for the federal government. Years ago, Secretary Stephen Chu, who was head of Department of Energy for the Obama administration, told the LA Times about climate change. I don't think the American public has gripped in its gut what could happen. We're looking at a scenario where there's no more agriculture in California. I don't actually see how they can keep their cities going either. This is Oregon. This is Oregon drought with counties in extreme drought in the southeast section, more Oregon. And the problem with Oregon is not so much lack of rainfall, it's lack of snowpack, which you heard about today. The real problem is that the temperatures are rising. And so if the temperatures are rising and they're too hot right now to give us snowpack, even when there's water, there's enough water sometimes, but it can't hold as snow. And if the trend is rising temperatures, this doesn't look like it's going to improve. If you talk to Nordic skiers, this is a place that hasn't been skied this winter. It's a common, it's a place that Nordic skiers went to ski quite often. They couldn't do it because there was no snow. We're getting incredible wildfires. California, just a few weeks ago, 21,000 people had to evacuate in the middle of the night to save their lives from explosive wildfire in their neighborhoods. And over 1,000 homes were just burned to the ground. And of course, then you have the storms as well. You have the flooding in places. And now it's projected that 1 in 6 species are threatened with extinction already. And the problem is, if you're like me, you're an optimist and you look at glass half empty, glass half full, this doesn't mean this isn't good. You don't look at this by saying, 5, 6 are okay. because these are all connected. It's all ecologically connected. This is a horrifying situation because these will result in whole ecosystems collapsing. Well, with food in trouble and water in trouble, you have people in trouble. Survival resources are threatened across this planet, and that gives rise to refugees. Last year, the Secretary of Defense announced that climate is an immediate military threat, an immediate security threat. Climate is a threat multiplier, meaning that where you already have stress in a region, climate makes it ever so worse. And it is underlying the conflict in Syria, part of it. Well, now we get to the very difficult part, because business as usual is a term that is used quite often, BAU. Business as usual means that we all wake up tomorrow and do the same thing we did today. And I assume you're all planning, because we're human beings, we like patterns, we like habits. I assume we're all going to wake up and do the same thing tomorrow that we did today. The problem is that leaves a world that isn't going to be broadly habitable, because business as usual is projected by the UN and by leading climate scientists to give a rise of up to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century, before the end of the century. So you look around at some of these young people, you think, how long are they supposed to live on this earth? Well, my grandfather lived to be 104. And so this means I have yet to find a scientist who says this is survivable, because all the impacts we've seen so far is from 1 degree. This is 11. And so what James Hansen, the former head of NASA's Goddard Space Institute, says, failure to act with all deliberate speed functionally becomes a decision to eliminate the option of preserving a habitable climate system. And so when we talk about impacts like water levels and recreation, snowpack, and so forth, what I do is I try to consolidate that out into habitable. That's my word, habitable, survivability. That's my word, and I project out to the end of the century. Now, if we had decades to deal with this, maybe I'd get a little more sleep at night. But I have 3 children, and they're still at home. And what haunts me and what haunts everybody I'm working with is these dangerous feedback loops. And those are processes in nature that make the situation potentially run out of control. So let me explain these. These are natural feedback loops, vicious cycles, you can think of them. And I'm only going to talk about 3 very briefly, but there's more than 3. One is that many of you know, carbon dioxide is absorbed by what we call sinks. So the forests are sinks. Sinks are good. And the forests absorb our carbon dioxide, the oceans absorb our carbon dioxide, and the soils absorb our carbon dioxide. Well, the forests, because they're heating, they're falling susceptible to insects, and they're burning, they're dying, and they're burning. When they burn, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and they don't serve as sinks anymore. They can't absorb our carbon dioxide. And of course, when we cut our forests, that's the most insane thing to do, because we're cutting our sinks, the remaining sinks that we have left. The albedo flip is a phenomena that you all know very well. If you go out on a hot day, and today was kind of a hot day, would you wear a black shirt or a white shirt? How many of you on a very hot day would wear a white shirt over a black shirt? So you know the albedo effect, because light reflects heat. Well, when you have the ice masses at the poles melting, this is ice that turns to water. Water's dark and it absorbs heat. So melting actually begets more melting. It actually heats the earth more. And then the third feedback that I'm going to talk about is really a terrifying carbon bomb lying up at the northern latitudes. The northern latitudes have permafrost, which contains methane and also carbon dioxide. And in frozen state, that doesn't emit a lot, but when it melts, it emits those greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and it's started to melt. So if this melt really gets going, it could swamp the atmosphere with so much that it wouldn't even matter if we cut all carbon dioxide and methane emissions the next day. Our impact wouldn't matter at that point. We're talking about uncontrollable heating, and it's already melting. So where does this leave us? Scientists say we are at a planetary tipping point. The tipping point means we have to act now. The tipping point means that we are effectively in a state of planetary emergency. Now, the difficult part of this is that if you go outside right now or tomorrow, nobody's going to act like they're in a state of emergency. You're going to go out and you're going to talk with people at the coffee shop, you're going to have a good time, and then you're going to go take your kids to soccer or whatever, and nobody's acting as if it's an emergency. And that's a real problem. And we'll get to this concept of emergency later, but I want to give you a quote which I think really describes it. By Richard Heinberg, the scale of what is at stake, because these tipping points, you see, would send our Earth into runaway heating that we can't call back. And we're at those tipping points. The scale of what is at stake runs straight off the charts. The decisions that have to be made and soon may well determine whether civilization survives. Now, that's just one quote. I read so much about, I could give you 20 quotes like that. It's just the one I happen to choose. And so we need a frame as to these fossil fuels and also methane in the natural gas. We need a frame to move forward. And that frame, this is tar sand development, but that frame is fossil free. And so this is starting to get to the optimistic part of our talk tonight, our time tonight, that there is a vision forward. It's a vision of a fossil free economy. And for the last over a century, we've been fueled by these very dirty fuels that have caused enormous problems for society. And now the sun is setting on them. And it has to be phased out to save basically the civilization that we know. Well, what will that look like? Well, it'll actually have a few co-benefits. Not so much devastation of the landscape, because not getting into gouging the landscape for every last drop of fuel. Not the toxic sludge and toxic waste associated with those, the huge amounts of air pollution, the mercury pollution that comes from those coal-fired plants and drops into every single lake in the United States that has been tested for mercury has mercury, and all the fish, and even those pristine Oregon and Idaho lakes have mercury. The little children with asthma from this pollution, the horrifying catastrophes that can result in our marine environment, and the condemnation of private property, all that is associated with this fossil fuel regime. It's not just climate change, it has a whole lot of negatives. And of course the fracking. I was just in Pennsylvania giving a climate talk. I couldn't drink the water there. Nobody drinks the water in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as far as I can tell. I mean, I did a little poll. They all drink bottled water because it's so contaminated, they say. Not to mention the corruption from the fossil fuel industry in our political system. Millions and millions of dollars pour into that system every year. Some cities are paving the way forward and thinking of a new vision and implementing it. Vancouver, Canada, just to the north of us, is striving to be all renewable energy by 2020. But our government has no plan. Our federal government has no climate plan. And we need to know that because lots of us read about the Obama Clean Power Plan. How many of you have heard about that? The Clean Power Plan. President Obama, he was up in Alaska, and he said, you know, it's terrible what's happening to Alaska, this threatening our children's future. But if you call him or if you write to him, he'll send a letter back saying, we've got the Clean Power Plan. That's not a plan. Actually, I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, but John Holdren, I think, describes it very well. He's the president's science advisor, and he says, the current situation of the world in relation to the climate problem is that we're in a car with bad brakes driving towards a cliff in the fog. There's still no comprehensive regulation of carbon dioxide. Despite a U.S. Supreme Court ruling back in 2007 that there's authority to regulate carbon dioxide. Now, the Clean Power Plan only addresses the energy sector, and it only calls for 1/5 of what the leading scientists say is minimally necessary to preserve a habitable planet. So it's not that it's not important. It's important. It's a tool, but it's not a plan. It's not the macro strategy. And at the same time, President Obama is moving forward on all fronts to develop fossil fuels through offshore drilling, mountaintop removal, fracking everywhere, coal mining. And this region is actually part of the plan. We have been targeted as the fossil fuel industry's gateway to Asia. So you can imagine all these fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and oil coming out of the interior of the United States. We are sitting right at the gateway to Asia. And so there are fossil fuel export facilities proposed all along our coastline of Oregon and Washington and up into British Columbia. This would transform our region. We're not a fossil fuel region. We're one of the few parts of the United States that can say, we're not a fossil fuel state, but this would transform us into that. In just Oregon and Washington over the past about 3 years, there have been 16 of these proposals proposed. Now, if you add those in with the ones for British Columbia, you actually come out with a carbon emissions footprint, if you burned all that, of 5 keystones. And everybody has heard about Keystone. Dr. Jim Hansen said that Keystone would be game over for the planet. Well, this, if you add up all the facilities, would be 5 times that. Already oil trains are moving through Portland and other parts of Oregon. And these, I won't talk about local effects, but these have very serious risks associated with them, very volatile oil that they're carrying. And there have been several train accidents over the last few years. Well, here locally, there's a tremendous concern over the Jordan Cove Energy Project, which would be a pipeline across Oregon to carry natural gas and then liquefy at Coos Bay. This involves tremendous condemnation of private property. When you think about pipeline, that's going to go through private property. There's a lot of private property rights on the line aside from any environmental issues. And of course, with any of these proposals, the argument for them is jobs. And it's as if the debate ends when somebody says jobs, jobs. Well, it's not that Oregon doesn't want jobs for these areas. These are very depressed areas that need economic revitalization. And so it's not as if they don't deserve jobs. They do deserve jobs. The question is whether the jobs we want in our communities are the kind of jobs that bring about literally a death toll and devastation associated with climate impacts and also with earthquake zones. So it's not a question of jobs, it's a question of what those jobs will bring. All over the world and all over this country, people are demanding change. They're demanding system change. Huge demonstrations all over the country against all of these fossil fuel projects and just fossil fuel in general. In this region, the protests kind of come under the heading of None Shall Pass. I call it the None Shall Pass movement. I'm not sure if that's a formal name or not, but the idea is none of these fossil fuels shall pass from the interior out. People in the Pacific Northwest, and that's Oregon and Washington, they're different from the rest of the country. We are culturally different. And I say that, very, I guess, with a lot of pride as a fourth-generation Oregonian. People in this region have come to realize that we have a distinct leverage now over the entire fossil fuel industry's designs to get that fossil fuel out. We have leverage that no other region has, and paired with the kind of culture that we have, that may amount to quite a bit of turnaround for the fossil fuel industry. You may have tracked the Shell Oil drilling protests in Seattle. Shell Oil brought a huge rig into Seattle, and the kayaktivists protested that. And then next month in Portland, they were out again protesting the next big rig. Shell Oil has just removed its plans for the Arctic. Now, a lot of that was they didn't find the big oil they were hoping for, but it's also the protests. So now you might be wondering, well, back to our government. What's our government doing? Our government is supposed to represent the people and supposed to protect us from environmental harm. I mean, that's the whole reason we have this agency, for example, right? They're supposed to represent the people. I will tell you, I've taught environmental law for over 20 years, and we've got plenty of law. That's not the problem. We've got plenty of environmental statutes. The problem is they have been turned into essentially a permit system by these agencies. Elizabeth Colbert says it very well, I think. It may seem impossible to believe that a technologically advanced society could choose, in essence, to destroy itself, but that is what we are now in the process of doing. And environmental law has become the tool of choice. Now, when I think about environmental law, I think there's one purpose of environmental law, and that's to keep us in compliance with nature's laws. If you talk to tribal people in this region, they emphasize nature's laws, and tribal people actually everywhere across the earth emphasize nature's laws. Oren Lyons says, the thing you have to understand about nature and natural laws, there's no mercy, there's only law. And so to me, the whole purpose of law is to bring us in compliance with these laws of nature, okay? Not to give permits to exacerbate the conditions, but bring us in compliance with the laws of nature. So now we have to say, well, what are the laws of nature? Well, let's just talk about the climate laws of nature. We're not going to talk about every law of nature. Well, in climate terms, the leading scientists say we have got to stabilize our climate, which means we've got to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stabilize it at about 350 parts per million, at least not over that. Now, pre-industrial levels were about 280 parts per million, so it's still above that. But right now, we are at 400 parts per million and going up fast. We are in a clear danger zone. And when you talk about law, you have to have clear goals. Otherwise, the law is just meaningless. And so you have to take this 350 parts per million and you have to put it on a time frame. Does that make sense to all of you? In other words, if you go into your city council, and you say, hey, mayor, I want you to achieve 350 in the next year. Well, they're not going to know what that means. 350 means nothing to government. What is meaningful is actions to change what we're doing now. So we have to take that 350 and turn it into a pathway or a glide path of emissions reduction to get us back to 350. Does that make sense to all of you? We're emitting carbon dioxide. We have to reduce carbon dioxide before a certain time, stay on the safe side of tipping points so that we reach 350 before we go over tipping points. Does that make sense? Okay, so if you don't know this, you don't know carbon math. In other words, why go to government and ask for anything if you don't know what you're asking for? And so this is kind of the key here. James Hansen, who's again the former head of Goddard Institute for Space Studies, assembled a team to develop what I call a prescription for the planet. It's a glide path of emissions reductions to get us to climate equilibrium. The really good news is that we can do this. If we go fossil free, we can do this, and he believes, and his team believes, achieve climate equilibrium not long past the end of the century. Now, is there any insurance policy for that? No. We have absolutely no insurance that we're going to survive no matter what we do. But this is the best out there in terms of a prescription. And so what he says, or the team says, is that we have to reduce 7% a year starting in year 2015. So can you remember that 7%? Can you walk away with that 7% as the carbon math of the day? Because this defines the goal of all of our efforts here, is the 7% annual global reduction. Now, this also has to be coupled with a huge drawdown of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, amounting to 100 gigatons. And that would involve reforestation and soil sequestration through natural farming methods. But I don't deal with that so much because that's not so much what citizens like you all can accomplish. I'm going to focus on the carbon math. Now here's the really amazing part and the alarming part. This is math in a minute glass because it goes up every day we delay. And so had your government officials started this task back in 2005, it would have been much easier because we would have had to reduce only 3.5% a year. Because your government, and I guess my government too, didn't focus on the action, it has caused a huge penalty and has made the slope much steeper. Do you see how that is? Now, this year is 7%, and this is the terrifying part, really. If we wait till 2020, which is just over 4 years from now, this shoots up to 15%. Someone I was speaking to recently said it's like compounding interest. At some point, it's not going to be feasible. At some point, you just can't do that every year across the globe. So, I started this talk by saying, we're in this incredible moment in time. You're just alive right there in front of me. You're all alive at this moment in time, and so am I. It is the most incredible moment when you think about it, perhaps in all of human history. Now, it's all in math, but we have to appreciate the fact that the carbon math has to add up. And this goes back to nature's laws. You can think of it this way. A rescue rope that's too short is no good at all. And yet, if you go into your legislator's offices, you table back here, you go into the Oregon State Legislature and each one of you go to a different office, except for one or two. They're going to say what they did last year. They're going to say, oh, we did the clean fuels thing. They will have absolutely no idea of this concept that progressive action is not enough in a time of climate emergency. It would have been probably enough decades ago, but it has to match the math. That's just logic. So I appeal to all of you to take a carbon math quiz, pop quiz. Don't give them warning, but take a pop quiz into your government officials. In fact, you've got 2 U.S. senators coming by here tomorrow morning. I would ask them personally, can you tell me? Now, I'm going to repeat. You all know the answer, right? You better remember it. Because if you ask them, you've got it. I've learned that as a teacher. You got to know the answer yourself. Okay. What annual rate of global carbon dioxide emissions reduction is necessary to restore planetary energy balance? What's the answer? 7%. They're going to say, I don't know. They're going to say, I don't know, and you're going to say 7% starting in 2015. Then you go on and tell them the numbers get bigger. But they literally don't, most literally don't understand that. And so now we get to the law part, because I've been teaching environmental law for over 20 years, and you might be wondering, well, why isn't the law doing anything? Well, the laws were passed in the 1970s, and they have very noble purposes. They really don't address the problem in a macro way. There's laws for wild horses and burros. There's the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the Bald Eagle Protection Act. There's all sorts of laws out there, but they don't add up to a recovery plan for the nation that we need. But there's other problems with environmental law too, and it's precisely the agencies that implement these laws. First of all, these agencies have enormous discretion to give out permits. All these laws have permit provisions, almost, except for the Wilderness Act is pretty tight. And the agencies have become politicized and really captured by the very industries that they are supposed to regulate. And how has this happened? It's because money has been funneled by the millions and millions of dollars over the decades since 1970 when these laws were passed. And the leaders, who are governors of different states and who are presidents and senators and so forth, get campaign contributions, and then they put pressure on the agencies to issue the permits. And so as a result, 99% of the permits in programs that have been studied are issued. The US government, the federal Congress, has known about the threat of climate crisis for a very long time. Back in 1986, senators wrote to the US EPA and said, there is a very real possibility that man, through ignorance or indifference or both, is irreversibly altering the ability of our atmosphere to perform basic life support functions. So they knew it back then, but the fossil fuel companies also knew it back then. They found out that they were causing potentially lethal conditions that would unravel civilization in 100 years or so. And they started a campaign of putting doubt in the minds of the public, and they also contributed millions of dollars to the political system. And as a result, Congress has done absolutely very little to address this problem. And so environmental law probably won't work in time. The Clean Power Plan won't work in time. But there is a third branch of government, and this is where I've focused my legal scholarship, and it relies on a doctrine called the public trust. So the public trust is not an environmental law statute. In fact, it's the oldest doctrine in our country in environmental law, and it comes from property law, actually. And the public trust declares a public property right. You all have a public property right, along with me, that we share, that is not in the nature of a private right that we can destroy what we own. Not that at all. It's a trust. How many of you are familiar with college accounts or retirement accounts that are trusts? So if I were a trustee for, say you in the front table set up $1 million, for your niece to go to college, and I was her trustee, I'm held to certain obligations. Well, there's a whole area of law on this. And the public side of this declares that our vital assets are held in trust by our government. So I'm not making this up. This is on the shelf to use. This is a principle of law that's older, much older than our environmental laws. And scores of cases declare that our government is trustee of our vital natural resources. And we, present but also future generations of citizens, are the beneficiaries with a clear property right in this natural trust, meaning the waters, the wildlife, the shorelines. I'm going to talk about the air in a moment. And so government can't just, well, let me back up. I can't, with your $1 million trust, I can't just go to Hawaii and have a nice vacation off that money. I have to use that money for your niece because you put it up for her. So by the same token, trustees have fiduciary obligations to protect the asset for the benefit of the beneficiaries, which, as you note, came from the court cases. Present and future generations are the beneficiaries of this trust. That's nothing new. But we've lost sight of it in our statutory law. And so the U.S. Supreme Court has actually said that this is a democratic sort of principle. The Supreme Court long ago in the last century invalidated the Illinois legislature's conveyance of shoreline to a private railroad company because it said, you can't do that. You can't privatize that. It's held in trust for the people. It said conveyance of the shoreline would be a grievance which could never be law borne by a free people. It also said that this is an attribute of sovereignty. The government can't just say, we don't like this trust. Your legislatures are bound by the trust because it's part of their sovereign compact with government. As one professor puts it, the public trust is the slate upon which all constitutions and laws are written, meaning this is a constitutional principle. Well, last year, actually in late 2013, this judge, who is Chief Justice of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, found that a pro-fracking law that the Pennsylvania legislature had passed was unconstitutional under this public trust, meaning that the legislature passed this fracking law to allow fracking all over the place. And the Supreme Court justice wrote an opinion on the public trust saying it violates the public trust, it's unconstitutional. And he said, furthermore, all citizens have certain inherent and indefeasible rights that are of such general, great, and essential quality as to be ensconced as inviolate. Meaning we have rights to the resources that support our survival, and that these are rights that government can't take from we, the people, because government only has the authority that we give it. So this is part of the social compact that the people have with government. So how have I applied this public trust to the atmosphere? I'm not involved in any of the litigation I'm going to explain because I'm just a professor, but I've written quite a bit on the approach called the atmospheric trust litigation approach. And what this is a macro approach to climate crisis. Now, it's no panacea, let me tell you that. There's nothing in the law that just provides a quick remedy. But this is a different area of law that is seeking to attack the problem and hold government accountable in time before the tipping points. And it's an area, it's a strategy that youth all over this country and now in many countries across the world are invoking, and I'll tell you about that. It asserts what's called an atmospheric trust claim that is the same in every case. The atmosphere is a trust asset, public trust asset. Sovereign nations are co-trustees of this asset, so not just this country, but other countries as well. And by the way, other countries have the public trust doctrine too. It's so old. It goes back to Roman law, and so countries around the world have the same doctrine. It's recognizable to them. The citizens are the beneficiaries, and there's a fiduciary obligation to protect the asset. So when you look at your government officials, you know, rather than talk about environmental statutory law, you can talk about that if you want, but talk to them about their role as trustee. They're sitting in office and they are trustees with a fiduciary obligation to you to protect your climate resources and your future. So this approach turns to the third branch of government. Not that that's a perfect branch either, but turns to the courts because we have three branches of government for a reason. And it turns to the courts and brings lawsuits asking for a plan, to order a plan to reduce carbon according to that 7%. So I'll talk about the litigation in a moment, but let me say that this approach recognizes that you can't have any sovereign opting out of this task. You can't have Idaho saying, oh, you know, we're not interested in climate action because we in Oregon, we can't take their share of carbon. We can't reduce twice to make up for Idaho. Every single sovereign has to have their responsible share accounted for. And so this doctrine applies generically to every single sovereign as a trustee. So in 2011, an organization called Our Children's Trust formed to carry out this legal approach all over the country and in nations across the world. It's gaining incredible momentum, and you can see, I put the website up there so you can access their materials. And I'm not a lawyer in this campaign, but I'll do my best to describe it. It was brought on behalf of youth across this nation and in every state in the country. And Our Children's Trust and lawyers working pro bono and for reduced fees filed petitions all over. So every single state has one of these petitions or cases in court right now. And these are some of the plaintiffs. They come from just all over the place. There's videos of these plaintiffs on the Our Children's Trust website. This last one is the Oregon plaintiff in the Oregon case, Kelsey Juliana, who's incredible. These cases have been gaining momentum. The first ones were dismissed by judges who said, you know, basically this is a job for the legislatures and the agencies. We don't want to be involved in, the judges were saying, we don't want to be involved in climate crisis. That's what your Oregon judge said, by the way. Up in Eugene, Oregon, the judge in that case said, for really 2 hours straight, I don't want to be involved in this. He was reversed by the Oregon Court of Appeals on a procedural ground, went back to him. He's pretty much said the same thing again, now it's on appeal. And my reaction to that is we just can't hope to solve this crisis by treating it like a game of hot potato. But there have been victories, too. More recently, in Washington, there was a huge victory 2 months ago in favor of the plaintiffs, and they sued their governor, and that's the plaintiffs with their governor right there. He looks pretty happy about it. And so there's another hearing coming up to further the case along. Other suits are winning, too. This is a campaign that has gone global. And Our Children's Trust is bringing lawsuits in all sorts of different countries across the world. This is an associated lawsuit that where the Dutch citizens sued their government and just had a big win just about 2 months ago. It was actually, I think, a day after that Washington win, where the court just said, you've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions more aggressively. And in Pakistan, just about a week or two ago, another big win on behalf of citizens that had sued their government, and the Supreme Court said, the delay and lethargy of the state offend the fundamental rights of the citizens. So what you have now in this state, we're not only living in the most incredible moment in time, I hope you appreciate that at least, but let me tell you, we're also living in the most incredible place that can inspire everybody else to take climate action. And also legally, we have the most important case on the planet right here in Oregon. And that's a case just filed about a month ago or 2 months ago by Our Children's Trust and youth, representing youth from across the country and from across the state against the Obama administration. And this case is a federal case. So I talked about the Oregon case, which was a state case. This is a federal case in front of a federal judge in Eugene, Oregon, not far up the road. And they have documented the indifference of the government towards this growing hazard for decades. And they have said defendants have acted with deliberate indifference to the peril they knowingly created. The youth plaintiffs are asking the Obama administration and the agencies for a climate recovery plan that's enforceable, that will correspond with the best available science to get us back to climate equilibrium. And so you may say, well, what's the value of a court? Many of you may not be familiar with courts. I think one of the main values of a court right now is to just focus the attention of the other branches of government on this emergency before it's too late. There's nothing like a judge to focus attention on a problem. So the court wouldn't write a climate recovery plan or say what measures are to be taken. That is the other branch's jobs, of course, as trustees. But somebody needs to get them to do it. And so that is the advantage of a judicial action. Now, each lawsuit, including the federal one, asks for climate recovery plans. But this is gaining momentum, but green dominoes have to start falling now in favor of the plaintiffs. Courts, I believe, once a few come out, like the tobacco litigation, once a few more come out in favor of the plaintiffs, I believe more and more will come, and we'll see, like the tobacco litigation, sort of a sweep. But they've got to start falling soon, and what affects that? Judges either have judicial courage or they don't. But they get judicial courage oftentimes from hearing the voices of the public. You can't lobby a judge like you can your legislature, but you can write letters to the editor, you can write opinion editorials, you can talk and so forth, have rallies in front of the courthouse, attend the hearings. These things make a huge difference, and the atmospheric trust litigation cases have been on national TV, have been on TV in other countries as well. On the Bill Moyers show, you can see both Kelsey and then me in a separate episode that ended Bill Moyers' career on television, actually. So, so where do we stand with the litigation? The world's former, or the nation's former chief climate scientist, who is also a plaintiff in the federal case, Jim Hansen, has issued a declaration saying judicial relief may be the best, the last, and at this late stage, the only real chance to preserve a habitable planet for young people and future generations. Now, I want to switch gears. We've talked about the law, and I do want to end with the citizen's role. What do you do in a climate emergency? And I think the first thing we have to recognize is we are in climate emergency, even though we can walk outside and everything looks rather normal. That's part of the problem here, right? And so we have to figure out how to deal with that. To me, we're in a climate emergency regardless of what we do. We're either going to be pulled into more catastrophic events, or we're going to treat this like an emergency that it is and push for renewable energy and localized solutions. But either way, it's an emergency. We're not going to be able to duck the fact that all of us are in an emergency either way. It's just which kind of emergency do we choose at this point? Now, in World War II, none of you are old enough to remember World War II, but it was all hands on deck time. And if you interview people who were alive in World War II, and I've interviewed plenty. My mother was alive, my grandmother was alive, both are deceased now, but they said, no one sat on the sidelines. Everybody used their particular talent, their resources, whatever they could give to the war effort, they gave to it. They figured out what they were good at doing, and they gave to that effort. And so this is the time for all of us to find our role and claim this incredible moment that we have on Earth. How do we do that? I think of it on 3 levels. I think of it, and I don't just do one in my personal life. I try to wake up every morning and do all 3 somehow. So I try to focus on citizenship, community, and consumption. Those are my 3 C's. So you can think of it as my relationship to my government, my relationship to my community, and my relationship to my family and my personal lifestyle. So let's start with citizenship to give you some ideas. I think people have lost faith in citizenship, but it works. Democracy needs citizenship, and environmental law for too long has pushed us away from our government because it's got so many acronyms and techno-jargon. We've always assumed that our governments were kind of protecting our environment, but citizenship works. What is Oregon's citizenship? I believe we are more positioned here because of our leverage than probably any other nation in the country to assert amazing citizenship and achieve what other states can't achieve. So what does it mean? I think there's 4 parts of being a citizen in Oregon right now, and I'm going to go through these 4 very briefly and then turn to community and consumption and then end. First of all, legislative action. Last year, there was a climate bill in front of the legislature that would have, and it was co-sponsored by your representative here, Peter Buckley. It was amazing. And it would have provided that macro approach to bringing down Oregon emissions. It was incredible. It died in the Rules Committee. Not for lack of Peter Buckley's efforts at all. It's those other legislators. It died in the Rules Committee. But it would have forced the agencies to create a plan to bring down carbon emissions according to the best scientific evidence. And so it would have forced your trustees to steer the ship. Right now, the legislators are very distracted. They don't focus on climate. They focus on marijuana, ethics, bunch of other things, but not climate. And so this would have done it. There is, I'm told, a round 2. And I cannot, as a public employee, take any position on legislation. There's no legislation in front of us right now. But watch this. Be engaged in your legislative process, because if Oregon passes a bill, this would have been in line with California's climate bill. If Oregon goes, bet you anything Washington will, especially you've got that ATL lawsuit with those 2 cute little kids standing next to their governor. There's some leverage in that. So you've got California moving full speed ahead. If you get Oregon and Washington, I'm told that's the 6th largest economy in the world. We are the next domino. And so there's a special legislative session coming up that you should really be tuned into. The second thing is this atmospheric trust campaign. There is an Oregon case right now. It's on appeal. You can check the status of that through our Children's Trust. There are a myriad number of ways to support a lawsuit, through letters to the editor, opinion editorials, just support for the organizations that bring these. Citizens can engage, even though you're not in court. It's your lawsuit. In many ways, it's the public's lawsuit, and citizens can engage that. The federal case, just up the road. It will be heard in the Federal District Court of Oregon. I think it's the most important case on the planet. It matters that people show up. That matters. That was 2. The third is the None Shall Pass campaign. There are these proposals all up and down the coast. Now, if you just even cared about earthquakes, you would be very interested in these proposals, because every single one of them is in an earthquake zone. And if you've not read the New Yorker article that came out not long ago on, I think it's called The Big One or something, please read it, because I haven't talked about earthquake hazards, but each one of these projects is on the coast. What citizens are doing across the Pacific Northwest is they're sort of swarming these projects. I've observed this. I call it swarming. I don't know what anyone else calls it, but they're figuring out what project is near them. They're not trying to tackle every project, but they're figuring out what project is near them, figuring out their position on that project, linking up with groups doing something about that project, and they are swarming that project. And so as a result, citizens are showing up to hearings, they're protesting in the streets, they're sitting down blocking operations in cases. And this actually sends a message to government not to permit more fossil fuel projects, and at least a couple have been denied or withdrawn. Now that was 3. The 4th citizenship thing, and I'm going to be wrapping up pretty quickly here, is local action. It sounds kind of inefficient, to just try to get every city in the country to do something. Boy, that sounds inefficient, but it really is the grassroots power. And if you think about where carbon reduction is going to occur and where citizens have the most impact, it really is locally. And so our Children's Trust, again, has another campaign, which is a youth-driven campaign to go before city councils and ask for a recovery plan. My mayor, Mayor Kitty Piercy, who really is one of my heroes, She directed the city council meetings last year, and little kids and high school kids came before the city council once a month to testify, asking the city to reduce the city's carbon dioxide emissions according to the best available science. And you know what? They won. They got that ordinance. And it was my feeling after observing this that the city council, that the adults just couldn't look those kids in the eyes anymore and not do something. And so when I talk to kids, I talk to a whole lot of youth under 18. They have no money. They can't vote. They have absolutely no power in this world. But I tell them they're the most powerful of all because they have the moral authority. When youth get in the room, the whole thing changes. And those adults cave because they cave to the kids because they can't look these kids in the eye and not give them hope for a future that they can survive in. A new campaign. And so, in Eugene, Corvallis, Bend, and Portland, Eugene is already moving into implementing this action plan. Kids testified 2 weeks ago before a city council. I think Mayor Piercy will tell you all about that tomorrow. Okay, so that was citizenship. The next one is community, and this is shorter. How do you engage your community? I think in two ways. One is communicate climate, the emergency, and number two is initiate change in your community. And so how do you communicate climate? Well, how many of you know about the victory speakers of World War II? Raise your hands. Anybody ever heard, you've heard of victory speakers? Anyone else? That's really a shame. Well, let me tell you, if I may, about the victory speakers. In World War II, the threat was not known to the average citizen. And the victory speakers were 100,000 average citizens that got together and made speeches in their local communities to tell people of the threat arising and what to do about it and the need for national defense. And they are accredited with mobilizing this whole nation in very short, in the very short term, almost overnight it seemed. My mother was a victory speaker. My grandmother was a victory speaker. So I grew up hearing about these victory speakers, and these were not, great orators. They weren't people that, gave speeches professionally. These were just average people trusted in the community. But they went out to every forum they could find to tell people of the threat. Well, today, we need climate victory speakers. We need people going to their PTA meetings, their clubs. We need people with small talk in the grocery lines, small talk, everywhere we do small talk. All of that could be a little victory speech that every single person in this room could launch on a daily basis. We have some national victory speakers. Bill McKibben, you heard from today. Naomi Klein is coming to Oregon in February. Ashley Funk, she's the plaintiff from Pennsylvania. She's speaking all over the place in Pennsylvania. And most recently, the visit we had in this country was from the Pope, who's written an entire document on the fundamental problems affecting our Mother Earth. So communicating, the other thing is simply taking initiative. No matter how great our local governments are, the task now is too big for them to accomplish alone. So all of the businesses, all of the community groups can be helping our government officials take initiative to reduce carbon and methane wherever possible. And so that means across the energy, food, waste, and transportation systems. They simply can't do it on their own. This happened in World War II. People reoriented their entire lifestyle. There's a great book called The Transition Handbook that you can look at that explains how to start this process. So I gave you three, and this is the third. I said citizenship, community, and now consumption. We have no hope of solving climate crisis by behaving as we do in our consumer lives. There's simply no hope. But the other thing is, even without climate crisis, we would be toast anyway with because our consumption patterns are simply using up too many resources. So the Pope has called for an ecological culture. You can download his encyclical, which is a big document, and read about ecological culture. It's incredible. Here's American consumption. This is hard. This is really tough because it's part of our culture. You know, when my kids go to school, the kid next to them says, "Hey, look at the new shoes I bought at the mall." Or when my nieces tell me what they've done for the weekend in Boise, "Oh, I went to the mall." So this is our culture. And the Pope says this is a sick culture. This is what our culture leads to, is unfathomable amounts of waste. But it's also using up the resources, even apart from climate. Put climate out of the picture, we would need another planet in 15 years to sustain this level of consumption. It's often said that we would need another planet if we wanted to sustain this level of consumption. The point being that we're going to be crashing our consumption anyway. We can't keep it up. It's simply, there's not enough resources. And so I think in Oregon, this is part of what I'm talking about with the culture. I'm privileged to be in a family that's been here for so long, and I believe there is an Oregon culture that we should celebrate and identify with and enhance and publicize to the world. Because I think in Oregon, in Southern Oregon, in Central Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, along the Columbia Gorge, I think many people are discovering this new lifestyle, and we are the new Oregon pioneers that will teach people not only how to do these things, but how great it is to live in this other lifestyle, this ecological culture, so to speak. But we must recognize that it's a different choice we make on a daily basis. I mean, this is really not easy. When I think of it, I think of sort of driving on a freeway. You know, you have the fast lane, the middle lane, the pull-out, and the bike path along the freeway. And so we're all, to some extent, in the fast lane. And it's really pretty easy to shift over to that middle lane, and then easy to shift into the slow lane. And when you're in the slow lane, I was in it all, for the drive down here, but I don't know about you, but I don't feel bad about that. I kind of like it. I kind of like being in the slow lane. And then when you turn out, you're not removed from society. You're not a weirdo. But you're sort of watching the pace go by and you're doing your own thing. Then when you're biking, it really gets fun. Because when you're on the bus or biking or walking, you've got your own lifestyle going. It is empowering. You're self-sufficient. You're not dependent on the fossil fuel companies. And then it starts to become addictive and contagious. Those are the two things, addictive and contagious. And then other people start doing it. We've got that going in Oregon. And so many Oregonians are saying no to convenience and the rat race, and they are choosing a different way. But we have to recognize, and I'd be a fraud if I didn't tell you this, it requires renegotiating your relationship with time. I was this weekend, I think I spent 4 hours doing applesauce, canning applesauce. I got this horrible burn last week from canning applesauce. I did it last year too, got a horrible burn for it. But anyway, regardless of the burn, the 3 hours or 4 hours I spent, that was me renegotiating my relationship with time. And you know what? 5 years ago, I kind of felt like a fool because everybody else was doing other things and seeming more productive. Now, I get messages and phone calls from neighbors and from friends saying, "Have you done your apples yet? I just got my tomatoes done." And it's contagious and it's spreading. It is very fulfilling. But it also means we reorient to our needs. It also means that my family is going to view my applesauce that I made as a staple, a food staple that came from local apples, and we're not going to go out and buy a bunch of packaged food. We're going to eat applesauce, and it is incredibly delicious. So there's some co-benefits to that too. So I'm going to wrap it up by saying that the most daunting thing we face, and I've never said this to an audience, this is sort of my first try at expressing this, but I think the most daunting thing we face is that we're in all these different realities in this country. There's the business as usual reality, which if you go out tomorrow or even tonight, you'll see business as usual out there. Most people ignoring the climate crisis. And that leads to inaction. People just aren't doing anything. They're not even acknowledging the problem. And then there's the people I run into quite a bit in Eugene who think it's over. They're just they just say there's no hope left. They haven't read the science recently that says there still is hope. They're not banking, as I am, on the momentum. There's momentum in climate change, yes. There's also human momentum that I personally am banking on. But those people are just under the table at Starbucks coffee. And then, and then there's the people that I love to be with, which is all of you. And that is, we're realistic, we've got a goal, we understand what we believe is the carbon math, and the carbon math may change, we're in for that. But we're doing whatever we can using whatever tools and talents we have. But it is a reality. We've got to all recognize that other people are in different realities. And what is difficult in this time is that many people just don't do anything because they say, well, I just can't save the whole world by myself. And they think if they can't save the whole world by themselves, there's no point in trying. And it's true, you cannot save the whole world by yourself, but the whole world can't be saved without you. And so the major message is to keep the focus every single day on citizens, community, and consumption, and understand that we alone have the power to decide what future we leave, and that we hopefully will leave this room not asserting the power of life, but rather the trust of life. So thank you very much.